Critically appraised topics. A critically appraised topic, or CAT, provides a quick and succinct assessment of what is known and not known in the scientific literature about an intervention or practical issue by using a systematic methodology to search and critically appraise primary studies. However, in order to be quick, a CAT makes concessions in relation to the breadth, depth, and comprehensiveness of the search. Aspects of the search may be limited to produce a quicker result. Searching a limited number of databases may be consulted, and unpublished research can be excluded. Sometimes a CAT may be limited to only meta-analyses and/or controlled studies. Data extraction. Only a limited amount of key data may be extracted, such as year, population, sector, sample size, main findings, and effect size. Critical appraisal. Quality appraisal is often limited to methodological appropriateness. Due to these limitations, a CAT is more prone to selection bias than a systematic review or rapid evidence assessment. Steps in the CAT process. A CAT involves the following steps. 1. Background. 2. Question. 3. Inclusion criteria. 4. Search strategy. 5. Study selection. 6. Data extraction. 7. Critical appraisal. 8. Results. 8.1. Definitions. 8.2. Causal mechanisms. 8.3. Main findings. 9. Conclusion. 10. Limitations. 11. Implications and recommendations. Step 1. Background. What is the context of the CAT question? The background should clearly state what the rationale for the CAT was and explain why the question being asked is important. You may also indicate how it might relate to a wider understanding of a general problem. Most CATs occur in the context of a specific organization. You should address this context, e.g., sector, history, characteristics, help specify the rationale for the CAT, and explain why the question is important for the organization, its members, or its clients. In formulating the CAT question, it is important to reflect on the potential stakeholders relevant to the general problem being addressed in order to tap deeper insight into the issues involved, e.g., internal stakeholders such as employees at different organizational levels or external stakeholders like clients or the community. Example 1. As a change consultant, I am expected to contribute to the realization of organizational change. The outcomes of change can be both positive and negative, depending on the type of change and the specific individual or group affected, particularly when the change has predominantly negative outcomes, e.g., layoffs. I think it is of utmost importance that the change process is fair and just. I am curious about the impact procedural justice has on the way people perceive the outcomes of organizational change. Interviewing. Example 2. Interviewing and who got what job are the most talked about subject on campus. Most students are getting ready to either get internships or full-time jobs this summer. It is widely believed that smiling during a job interview may increase your chances of getting hired. This CAT was conducted to understand whether this claim is supported by scientific evidence. Example 3. Hoping to imitate the innovative and flexible work environments found at startups and companies like Google, my organization's executive director is considering implementing a bullpen-style open plan layout. Currently, our office is divided into individual workspaces with half walls. The executive director and controller both have private offices. With 15 employees working in a relatively small space, I worry that the distractions created by a new open layout may undermine our ability to focus and to be productive at work. To draw a more informed conclusion on the effect that such a layout might have at our office, I have gathered and assessed the quality of available scientific evidence, outlined key findings, and summarized their practical implications. Step 2. Formulating the CAT question. What does the CAT answer? You can use a CAT to answer many different types of questions. For the purposes of this guideline, we split these into impact and non-impact questions. This distinction is not ideal, but reflects the fact that the most common CAT questions are about either the effect of an intervention, factor, or independent variable, or the drivers of a certain outcome. Example 1. What is known in the scientific literature about the impact of goal setting on the task performance of sales agents? Example 2. What is known in scientific literature about the impact of smiling during job interviews? Do people who smile more have better chances of getting hired? Example 3. What is known in the scientific literature about the impact of flexible work schedules on task performance? Example 4. What is known in the scientific literature about the effect of open office layouts on workers' task performance? Non-impact questions. You can, however, use CATs to answer a range of other questions, which can be grouped as needs. What do people want or need? Attitude. What do people think or feel? Experience. What are people's experiences? Prevalence. How many / often do people / organizations ? Procedure. How can we implement? Process. How does it work? Exploration. Why does it work? Example. Main question. What is known in the scientific literature about the prevalence of burnout among nurses in the U.S.? Supplementary questions. What is burnout? What are the symptoms of burnout more widely and for nurses more specifically? Are there reliable and valid instruments available to measure burnout? Peacock. A peacock, P-I-C-O-C, is a mnemonic used to assist reviewers to search for studies that are relevant to the professional context described in Step 1, Background. The PEACOCK acronym stands for P, population. Who, type of employee, subgroup, people who may be affected by the outcome. I, intervention. What or how. Management technique, method, factor, independent variable. C, comparison. Compared to what? Alternative intervention, factor, variable. O, outcome. What are you trying to accomplish, improve, or change? Purpose, object, dependent variable. C, context. In what kind of organization or circumstances? Type of organization, sector, relevant contextual factors. Each element of the peacock is vital in focusing the question and searching effectively for the most relevant evidence. Example 1. P, physicians. I, 360-degree feedback. C, coaching. O, increased task performance. C, university hospital that has recently undergone significant organizational restructuring. Example 2. P, software developers. I, agile working. C, business as usual, status quo. O, reduced software development costs. C, large international IT firm in a highly competitive market. In addition, your peacock will help you determine whether the findings of a study will be generalizable and applicable to your organizational context. More specifically, your peacock helps to answer the question of whether your population, outcome of interest, and organizational characteristics are so different from those in the study that its results may be difficult to apply. After all, some psychological principles are generalizable to all human beings, but sometimes what works in one narrowly defined setting may not work in another. Step 3. Defining inclusion criteria. Which studies will be taken into account? One of the features that distinguishes a CAT from a traditional review is the pre-specification criteria for including and excluding studies. The inclusion criteria, also referred to as eligibility criteria, help the reviewers to determine whether a study will be included in the CAT when reviewing its abstract and/or full text. The inclusion criteria should be guided by your CAT questions and objectives, and by the outcome measures that you will be considering to answer your question. They define the studies that the search strategy is attempting to locate. Example: inclusion criteria. 1. Date. Published in the period 1980 to 2016 for meta-analyses and the period 2000 to 2016 for primary studies. 2. Language. Articles in English. 3. Type of studies. Quantitative, empirical studies. 4. Study design. Only meta-analyses or controlled studies. 5. Measurement. A. Studies in which the effect of goal setting on organizational outcomes was measured, or B. Studies in which the effect of moderators and/or mediators on the outcome of goal setting was measured. 6. Outcome. Task performance. 7. Context. Studies related to workplace settings. Exclusion criteria. Studies including goal setting as part of health, lifestyle, or treatment-related interventions. Step 4. Search strategy. How should the studies be sought? Based on the question, you next have to conduct a structured search for all relevant studies in the international research literature. In the first instance, you should concentrate your search on relevant bibliographical databases using clearly defined search terms. At the very least, conduct your search using ABI/INFORM from ProQuest and Business Source Premier from EBSCO. Depending on the CAT question, you may also need to search databases that are aimed at neighboring disciplines such as psychology, PsycInfo, education, ERIC, or healthcare, PubMed. Example: the following 4 databases were used to identify studies, Global and PsycInfo. The following generic search filters were applied to all databases during the search. 1. Scholarly journals, peer-reviewed. 2. Published in the period 1980 to 2016 for meta-analyses and the period 2000 to 2016 for primary studies. 3. Articles in English. A search was conducted using combinations of different search terms, such as job interview, employment interview, selection interview, and smiling. Documentation of the search. It is important that the search conducted is transparent, verifiable, and reproducible. For this reason, the search process should be clearly documented, preferably in the form of a table that shows which search terms were used, how search terms were combined, and how many studies were found at every step. An example is provided below. Step 5. Study selection. How should you select the studies? In general, a search will yield a large number of studies, sometimes more than 100. Some studies will not be directly relevant to the research question and PCOG. Hence, the next step is to screen them to check that they meet the inclusion criteria. Screening is usually a 2-stage process. The first involves reviewing the abstracts, and the second, reviewing the full studies. Review abstracts. This involves reading the abstracts that have been found through the searching. Each abstract should be compared against the inclusion criteria, and if the abstract meets the criteria, then the study should be read. Not all abstracts will contain information on all the inclusion criteria. This is particularly a problem with electronic searching. In these cases, decisions need to be made on whether or not to include the study on the information available. When in doubt, the study should be included. Review full studies. You should read the full article and compare it against the inclusion criteria. Example: selection took place in 2 phases. First, the titles and abstracts of 83 studies identified were screened for their relevance to this CAT. In case of doubt, the study was included. Duplicate publications were removed. This first phase yielded 2 meta-analyses and 12 controlled or longitudinal studies. Step 6. Data extraction. What information should be extracted? Data extraction involves the collation of the results and other information of the studies included. From each study, information relevant to the CAT question, such as year of publication, research design, sample size, population, outcome measures, main findings, effect sizes, weaknesses, and the final level of trustworthiness should be reported, preferably in the form of a clearly structured table. An example is provided on the next page. Step 7. Critical appraisal. How should the quality of the studies be judged? Methodological appropriateness. You can usually find a study to support or refute almost any theory or claim. It is thus important that you determine which studies are trustworthy, valid, and reliable, and which are not. You should first determine the trustworthiness of a scientific study by its methodological appropriateness. For cause and effect claims, a study has a high methodological appropriateness when it fulfills the 3 conditions required for causal inference: covariation, time-order relationship, and elimination of plausible alternative causes. A study that uses a control group, random assignment, and before and after measurement is therefore regarded as the gold standard for effect studies. Non-randomized studies and before-after studies come next in terms of appropriateness. Cross-sectional studies and case studies are regarded as having the greatest chance of showing bias in their results and thus fall lower in the ranking of appropriateness. Systematic reviews or meta-analyses based on pooled results of randomized control studies are thus regarded as the most appropriate design. To determine the methodological appropriateness of effect studies and impact evaluations, we recommend using the following 6 levels of appropriateness, which are based on the classification system of Shadish, Cook, and Campbell, and Pettigrew and Roberts. Design. Systematic review or meta-analysis of randomized control studies. Level, AA. Design. Systematic review or meta-analysis of non-randomized control and or before-after studies. Level, A. Design. Randomized controlled study. Level, A. Design. Systematic review or meta-analysis of controlled studies without a pretest or controlled study with a pretest. Level, B. Design. Non-randomized controlled before-after study. Level, B. Design. Interrupted time series. Level, B. Design. Systematic review or meta-analysis of cross-sectional studies. Level, C. Design. Controlled study without a pretest or uncontrolled study with a pretest. Level, C. Design. Cross-sectional study. Level, D. Design. Case studies, case reports, traditional literature reviews, theoretical papers. Level, E. Note, however, that the level of methodological appropriateness, as explained above, is only relevant in assessing the validity of a study that examines a cause and effect relationship that might exist between an intervention and its outcomes. When the CAT question concerns a non-effect or non-impact question, for example, the prevalence of phenomenon, a cross-sectional study may be the most appropriate design. Example 1. The overall quality of the studies included was high. Of the 4 meta-analyses, 3 included randomized and/or non-randomized controlled studies and were therefore qualified as level A or double A. The remaining meta-analysis was graded as level C because it was insufficiently clear what type of studies were included. The actual level of evidence of this meta-analysis, and as a result, the overall quality of the studies included in this CAT, may therefore be higher. All 3 primary studies used a cross-sectional design and were therefore graded level D. Example 2. After critical appraisal of the 24 studies, only 4 studies were included. Most studies were excluded because they had serious methodological shortcomings. One of the studies concerned a systematic review representing the result of 18 studies. The overall quality of the included studies, however, was low. For instance, all but 2 of the studies included in the systematic review were self-report surveys, and due to heterogeneity between studies, it was not possible to calculate a pooled estimate of effect. The 3 single primary studies used a cross-sectional design. As a result, the trustworthiness of the scientific evidence supporting the following main findings is very limited. Effect sizes. An outcome can be statistically significant, but it may not necessarily be practically relevant. Note that even a trivial effect can be statistically significant if the sample size is large. This works the other way around as well. Even a large, practical relevant effect can be statistically non-significant if the sample size is small. Also, keep in mind that p-values do not measure the probability that the studied hypothesis is true or the probability that the data were produced by random chance alone. Nor can a p-value tell you the size of an effect, the strength of the evidence, or the importance of a result. For this reason, you should pay little attention to the p-value, but instead assess the effect size, a standard measure of the magnitude of the effect of the studies included when addressing impact questions. To determine the magnitude of an effect, apply Cohen's rules of thumb. According to Cohen, a small effect is an effect that is only visible through careful examination. A medium effect, however, is one that is visible to the naked eye of a careful observer. Finally, a large effect is one that anybody can easily see because it is substantial. Note, however, that Cohen's rules of thumb were meant to be exactly that, rules of thumb, and are for many reasons arbitrary. For example, a standard mean difference of 0.20 may be regarded as small when the outcome concerns job satisfaction, but large when the outcome concerns fatal medical errors. When assessing impact, it is therefore important to relate the effect size directly to the outcome that was measured. Step 8. Results. What did you find? Step 8.1. Definition. What is meant by X? Most CAT questions include one or more key elements or constructs for which several definitions are available. In this step, you should provide an overview of the most common definitions. Example: an incentive is commonly defined as something that arouses action or activity. In the domain of management, incentives can be defined as plans that have predetermined criteria and standards, as well as understood policies for determining and allocating rewards. Incentives include all forms of rewards and punishments that are based on an employee's performance or behavior. Promotions, grades, awards, praise, and recognition are therefore all incentives. However, financial incentives such as money, bonus plans, or stock options are the most commonly used. Formally, incentives differ from rewards. Incentives refer to all stimuli that are provided in advance, whereas rewards are offered after a given performance. In the scientific literature and management practice, however, these terms are used interchangeably. Example 2. A smile is defined as a pleased, kind, or amused expression, typically with the corners of the mouth turned up and the front teeth exposed. A neutral expression is a blank facial expression characterized by neutral positioning of the facial features, implying a lack of strong emotion. Example 3. The concept of self-managing teams is referred to in various ways, using terms such as an autonomous group, shared, or self-directed teams. All of these terms refer to teams that are hallmarked by autonomy. We use the term self-managing teams to cover all of the different descriptions of this concept. Doe et al. Refer to the standard definition of autonomous groups as groups responsible for a complete product or service, or a major part of production process. They control members' task behavior and make decisions about task assignment and work methods. Step 8.2. Causal mechanism. How is X assumed to have an effect on Y? A causal mechanism spells out the process by which an intervention, construct, or phenomenon is expected to have an effect on a certain outcome. The causal mechanism is often based on one or more social or psychological theories that explain why the assumed effect occurs and under which circumstances. As Doe et al. Describe, the presumed causal mechanism behind open-plan office work as follows: breaking down physical barriers to increase one's exposure to teammates. Increased exposure facilitates communication among teammates. Facilitated communication increases collaboration. Increased collaboration increases overall productivity and performance. However, one can also presume that increased exposure to teammates might also cause increases in visual and auditory distractions, counteracting positive benefits to some degree. The construct of perceived supervisory support stems from the norm of reciprocity, which states that people treat others as they would like to be treated, repaying kindness with kindness and retaliating against those who inflict harm. Put differently, when a manager helps his or her employees in times of need or recognizes their extra effort, the employees will feel inclined to act to benefit that manager, and thus the organization as a whole. Not surprisingly, physicians experiencing inadequate supervisory support tend to describe their commitment to the hospital and its patients in negative terms, which in turn negatively affects their performance. Step 8.3. Main findings. In this section, you should provide an overview of the main findings relevant to the CAT question. For each finding, you should present the main evidence from the CAT, including its level of trustworthiness and, if available, effect size. Example 1. Smiling is weakly correlated with job interview success, level D. Putting on a smile may be advantageous by comparison with remaining neutral, which may be seen as reflecting a lack of interest or involvement. But there are other factors at play too during the interview, and just smiling is weakly correlated to success. Example 2. Overall, financial incentives have a moderate positive effect on performance, level A. There is strong evidence that financial incentives tend to have a moderate positive effect on performance. This positive effect is often referred to as the price effect. The financial incentive increases the intention to perform well because of the monetary benefit. However, this effect differs between forms of incentives, types of motivation, and performance outcomes, as described in the following findings. Moreover, when financial incentives are high, they can hamper performance by interfering with learning and promoting inappropriate risk-taking. Example 3. When employees must first acquire requisite knowledge or skills to perform the task, specific and challenging goals can have a large negative effect on performance, level A. Several randomized controlled studies have demonstrated that when a task requires the acquisition of knowledge before it can be performed effectively, a general goal leads to higher performance than a specific high goal. In fact, when knowledge acquisition is necessary for effectively performing a task, setting a specific but extremely high performance goal can lead people to ruminate on the potential negative consequences of failure rather than focus on task-relevant ways to attain the goal. Example 4. Arousing fear leads employees to engage in short-term thinking, level B. Fear can be aroused in people with a specific goal in mind, to take preventative measures or to stimulate proactive behavior. However, there is strong evidence indicating that fear tends to lead people to engage in short-term thinking, narrowing their attention to immediate consequences. Example 5. The outcome of the manager's own performance appraisal has a large effect on how they evaluate their employees. Level A. A combination of studies, including a randomized controlled study, demonstrated that managers who receive positive feedback about their performance subsequently rate their employee higher than managers who receive negative feedback regarding their own performance. Surprisingly, this effect even occurred when managers knew their own evaluation was bogus. Example 6. Managers' power level has a large to moderate effect on how they rate both others and themselves. Level A. A meta-analysis of 46 studies indicates that as a manager's power level grows, his or her evaluation of others becomes increasingly negative, whereas evaluations of him or herself become ever more positive. This finding suggests that performance evaluations by supervisors should be considered in light of their hierarchical position and power level. Example 7. Managing the customer experience may have a moderate positive effect on a company's financial performance. Level D. Findings from cross-sectional studies suggest that proactive customer experience management, CEM, such as customer touchpoints, customer focus, goals for customer experiences, customer insight, employee recruitment and training, may have a positive effect on the company's financial performance. Step 9. Conclusion. You should make the conclusion of your CAT a concise statement of 2 or 3 sentences on the main findings on the CAT question. Example 1. Scientific research literature supports my assumption that a fair change process is important to realizing successful change, given the moderate positive effects of procedural justice on organizational outcomes. Although the effects are mostly small to medium, the indications are that there is indeed a positive relationship between procedural justice and acceptance, commitment and behavior during organizational change. Example 2. We can conclude that financial incentives can have a positive impact on performance, also known as the price effect. However, financial incentives also have a negative impact on the intrinsic motivation of employees, which is known as the crowding out effect. The net result of these two opposing effects determines a possible gain or loss in performance. In addition, the net effect is influenced by several mediating and moderating variables. Example 3. Goal setting is one of the most powerful and evidence-based interventions for enhancing performance, provided that moderating factors such as goal attribute, type of task, organizational context, and employee characteristics are carefully taken into account. Example 4. The scientific literature does not support the claim that organizational change requires leaders with strong emotional intelligence. Example 5. While I was unable to derive a direct cause and effect relationship based on this CAT, we can observe general trends that can inform practice. For example, taking proactive action to meet the needs of volunteers is likely to improve their well-being, foment loyalty among volunteer corps, and tend to improve the work for nonprofit and voluntary organizations. However, the studies are too limited and flawed to recommend wholesale changes across the nonprofit sector, but their conclusions can at least prompt some internal assessment for the nonprofit manager considering further investment in a volunteer program. Example 6. Corporate social responsibility has been shown to have a positive correlation with corporate finance performance as defined by both accounting and market performance. That being said, causality has yet to be proven. There is a bidirectional correlation between the two variables, meaning that financial performance is correlated with social performance and vice versa. Furthermore, while firm size and year of observation have been shown not to have an effect on the CSP-CFP relationship, other confounding variables such as national culture, research methodology, and types of interventions may still affect the observed correlation. Step 10. Limitations. In a CAT, you are aiming to provide a balanced assessment of what is known and not known in the scientific literature about an intervention or practical issue by using a systematic methodology to search and critically appraise empirical studies. Nevertheless, all CAT have limitations. In your CAT, you should explicitly describe any limitations and discuss how they possibly impacted the findings of the assessment. Below is an example of the description of limitations that are inherent to CATs. Example: concessions were made in relation to the breadth and depth of the search process. As a consequence, some relevant studies may have been missed. A second limitation concerns the critical appraisal of the studies included. This CAT did not conduct a comprehensive review of the psychometric properties of the tests, scales, and questionnaires used. A third limitation concerns the fact that the evidence of several moderators is often based on a limited number, sometimes only one, of studies. Although most of these studies were well controlled or even randomized, no single study can be considered to be strong evidence. It is merely indicative. Finally, this CAT focused only on meta-analyses. As a consequence, relevant findings may have been missed. Given these limitations, care must be taken not to present the findings presented in CAT as conclusive. Step 11. Implications and recommendations. Once you have used the evidence found to answer the CAT's main question, you should use the final part of the assessment to relate the findings to the background of the CAT and the peacock described in Step 1 and 2. For example, is the evidence supportive of current practice? What are the estimated benefits and harms? What, based on the evidence found, are your specific recommendations for action? Importantly, how might you consider the concerns and interests of different organizational stakeholders in your recommendations? Example 1. The fair process effect in organizations is observed when change leaders increase aspects of their decision-making process, specifically consistency, accuracy, lack of bias, and openness to employee input. When procedural justice is not taken into account, employees may feel treated unfairly and resistance to change may increase. To actively design a fair change process, the 6 classic criteria for procedural justice specified by Doe may serve as a useful checklist. These criteria can be turned into practical guidelines for the purpose of organizational change as follows. A. The change approach needs to be consistently applied to all employees at all times. B. It needs to be impartial. C. The information on which decisions are based needs to be accurate. D. Opportunities should be provided to correct or change plans or processes. E. Those responsible for the organizational change need to represent the interests of all stakeholders affected by the change. And F. The ethical standards and values of those involved should never be disregarded. Example 2. Financial incentives can be used to increase the employee motivation and performance needed to support change. However, upper management should have a clear vision about the change in performance or behavior that it desires, as it requires different approaches to incentivizing. Intrinsically motivated employees executing interesting tasks and quality outcomes should be encouraged by indirect incentives in order to avoid eroding that motivation. Direct financial incentives are effective when intrinsic motivation and quality performance need to be stimulated. Upper management should therefore frequently calculate the proposed net effect when defining a pay plan. Lastly, if the plan is designed to increase team performance, all incentives should not be distributed equally, as this may harm individual motivation. Example 3. The continuation of the client's mentoring program should be seriously weighed at this time, given the evidence that A. The effect of youth mentoring on academic outcomes is small, and B. Fidelity to matching relationships and sustaining them over the long term may provide greater benefit. Given that the organization's program is school-based and effective long-term mentors are challenging to recruit and retain, the organization may want to consider suspending its mentor program. Given that the organization staff is overextended and that budget allocations across programs are at risk, I would recommend that mentoring activities be suspended at the end of the school year. All right, that's the end.